Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks once again for joining me for an episode of Cardoodle. This is Jim. This week I'm working on 2 shots for the next episode of Welcome to Boulder Dash, one of which is the background for a field reporter, the other of which is a 5-day weather forecast. I expect this episode to be done by this Friday, and while I know this is really bad marketing on my part, I'm not entirely sure that this episode's gonna be funny anymore. Minor spoiler, this episode is about how local news teams tend to freak out over minor weather stories, but in light of the blizzards that have hit the Midwest this past week, I'm not sure if it actually is funny because this actually has been an unexpected weather event. So it's not a very timely cartoon, though maybe it'll be funnier in the future, I don't know. The cartoon's mostly done, so this is just one of those things I'm gonna have to move past. Either way, I do hope you enjoy it. Anyway, it's on to those promised stories about my short time in broadcasting. Now, before I get into any of my experiences on the news team, which are far more interesting than anything else I did that summer, I do want to talk about one particular experience I had in the master control room. If you're not familiar, the master control room is an area in basically any broadcasting station that's full of TV monitors and buttons and switches and tapes and all sorts of things. And the job of the person in the master control room is essentially to make sure that the feed keeps going to televisions all around the area, as well as making sure commercials are inserted at the proper times. So for about half of the summer, I worked in that room for the early evening shift. I think it was something like 4 o'clock to midnight. I basically needed to push buttons at specific times during the night to make sure satellite feeds were recorded, as well as flip a switch to make sure local ads were played over the national ads of the local ABC broadcast. So on the evening of 4th of July, everything was going as normal. Grey's Anatomy was playing on several of the monitors, and according to the list I had, it was time for me to press a button to make sure the local ad played. And when I pressed it, nothing happened. Well, there was another switch that let me override the broadcast as well. I tried that one. That one worked, but instead was playing a different set of commercials. As it turned out, the person on the shift before me failed to put the commercials into the computerized playlist properly. So I'm panicking. I'm hitting any button that might indicate that it's gonna do what I want it to do. I'm trying to rearrange the playlist so it works properly. In the meantime, Grey's Anatomy is coming back on, and I'm basically randomly interrupting it with random commercials for about 3 seconds at a time. Meanwhile, the local ads, which have been paid for already, aren't playing. In my panic, I picked up the company directory. I tried calling our engineer, no answer. I tried calling the guy in the shift before me. His phone had been cut off due to non-payment of his bill. I tried calling one of the managers, no answer either. Finally, I find a name I don't recognize, and I just decide, you know what, I'm gonna call this one. Turns out it's the guy who takes the early morning shift, so I've never actually met him before. And forgive me, I don't remember this guy's name, but he was so kind to just drive on over to the station in the middle of the night and diagnose and fix the problem. I came in the next day completely nerve-wracked. I was sweating, I was shaking, and sure enough, I heard several of the higher-ups of the company kind of talking about the incident from the night before. And so one of them called me over to that group, and I was sure I was just about to get fired in front of all these people for ruining Grey's Anatomy and ripping off a bunch of our advertisers. You can imagine the confusion and relief I felt when they just asked me what happened. When I explained the situation, they said, well, alright, we'll work it out with the advertisers. And that was it. I went back about my normal workday. My only guess as to why I wasn't immediately sacked for basically chopping up one of the most popular shows on TV was because it was 4th of July and not a lot of people were watching. So I was never actually on camera for any of this experience. That was left to much more talented and frankly better looking people than myself. A lot of what I did was research, writing, interviews, and a little bit of camera work. One of those stories had to do with the Georgia water restrictions, as at the time some people were getting notices on their walls about their sprinkler systems. So the story was essentially about looking out for these notices and what to do about them if you got one. I got to shadow a story about chickenpox vaccine shortages, although I think my biggest success and my biggest failure during that internship had to do with politics. The first one had to do with some members of city council who were up for election. Now, this normally wouldn't be a big deal, except they were filling a seat that would be the deciding vote on whether or not a major hotel was going to be built in the area. One candidate was for construction to help build a local economy. The other was against it to avoid traffic congestion and taking business away from local establishments because this hotel was going to be built by a major chain. Now, I'm not going to get involved on what my personal convictions were about this. That was none of my business for this job, and it's none of my business now. The other intern and I were assigned to basically do this one on our own. The interview with one of the candidates went just basically fine. We sat down at a table, we talked a little bit about the viewpoint, and that was the end of it. The second interview, however, was where the major missteps were made. While both interviews were done down at City Hall, they were done in different rooms. The first interview was done in a meeting room, the second was done in the main hallway. And in this main hallway, as you'll often find in city halls, there was an American flag where this candidate decided to stand. And rather than having her move to a more neutral location, we decided to let her stand right there next to the flag. In other words, we were letting this politician frame our shot, which we really shouldn't have done. So while there was zero intention of creating a biased interview, and in fact our questions weren't biased at all, it ended up being biased because we let that politician frame the shot, which was honestly a huge failure on both my and the other intern's part. What I will say is that this experience gave me sympathy for reporters who were often accused of having an agenda or a bias in their reporting. While I was very inexperienced and were I still in this field, I probably would do my best to make sure it didn't happen again. Anybody who creates a report is still human and subject to those kinds of errors. I'm not saying that there aren't reporters out there that do have an agenda. What I am saying is I'm more sympathetic and more open to the idea that maybe any kind of bias seen wasn't intentional. But I think the biggest success I had during that time was actually a scandal involving the mayor using city funds for his own personal travel. It caused a big stir in the town, especially because he was visiting foreign politicians on non-city business, specifically a foreign politician who had some very harsh things to say about America and the 9/11 attacks. Needless to say, this was not very popular among the local population, but I got to talk to a lot of fascinating people, not including the mayor's press secretary. He hated us. Though I got to talk to people in the city council and even the president of the World Conference of Mayors. And I was actually surprised to find out that the main headquarters of ABC actually got in touch with our station and wanted to use the information from the story I worked on for their broadcast. How much of that actually ended up in the broadcast, I will never know. Now, I do want to say I don't deserve all the credit for this. This was definitely a team effort because it was a big story. There were a few other people also working on it, but it was so neat to be involved in something that actually became a national story. And it ended up being the last one I worked on that summer. It was the end of summer and I needed to go back to school. Besides, I'd already maxed out the number of college credits I could have earned from that job. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed these stories the past few weeks. Expect the next episode of Welcome to Boulder Dash this Friday. As always, thank you so much for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And as always, do like your mom told you and share. I'll see you wonderful people next week.